I think we can start. I'm Ed Narsessian, director of the Helix Center. Today's program on poetry and aging, or aging and poetry, was proposed by a member of the Helix executive board, Anne-Marie Levine, who's herself a poet, and she will take over after I mention the programs we are having for the next few months. So the next program we have in the last third week of November is going to be on otherness. After that, on January 11, it will be Why War. On February 15th, it will be Death and Literature, though it may be death without literature. We have still debating. And then after that, March 8th will be Function of Art. On March 22nd would be Music and Mind. On April 5th, Science and Spirituality. On April 19, Mindfulness. On May 10, Neurodiversity. And on May 24, we don't have a title for it yet, but it will involve the writer Robert Walser. So that's it. Anne-Marie will take over. Just leave it. Oh, no, you can talk sitting down.
Oh, I can talk sitting down. Oh, great. I don't have to get up. Okay. I just heard a big squeak. Okay. So I'm Anne-Marie Levine, and a member of the committee and at the Helix Center. And I put together this roundtable at the suggestion of Dr. Lewis called The Poetry of Aging, which brings together poets, psychoanalysts, critics, and translators to consider questions that seem more compelling than ever in our aging society. I'm going to introduce our guests in alphabetical order with abbreviated biographies. The more complete versions are on your programs, and then we'll get to the program itself. So would you each put your hand up when I mention your name so as to identify yourself to the audience? I'm going to start with you because you're right across from me.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. Well, no, I shouldn't do that because it's alphabetical order. No, we'll do that later. All right. Rachel Hadis is a poet, essayist, and translator, and a professor of English at Rutgers University. She's the author of many books, including most recently Ghost Guest. Her newest collection, 44 Pastorals, is forthcoming, and her poem Voyage is included in the Best American Poetry of 2024. She's also the author of a book called Strange Relation, subtitled A Memoir of Marriage, Dementia, and Poetry. Owen Lewis is the author of 3 collections of poetry and 3 chapbooks, most recently Knock Knock in 2024. His poetry and literary essays have appeared in numerous journals. He's professor of psychiatry at Columbia University in the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics, and adjunct professor of psychiatry at Einstein School of Medicine. In both departments, he teaches applications of narrative medicine. James Marcus is the author most recently of Glad to the Brink of Fear, a portrait of Ralph Waldo Emerson, a book that I hope he'll speak about today. He has translated 7 books from the Italian, and his essays and criticism have appeared in The New Yorker, The Times Literary Supplement, The Nation, and many other publications. He's also the former editor of Harper's Magazine and currently teaches at NYU's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. Wendy Sloan is a poet, translator, essayist, and retired labor law attorney. Her work has appeared widely in journals and anthologies, and her collection of poems, Sunday Mornings at the Café Mediterraneum, appeared from Kelsey Books in 2016. Wendy's collaborative work, Amicizia, was launched in March at the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. It is an imagined friendship book of Baroque Italian artists Artemisia Gentileschi and Giovanna Carzoni. Caitlin Snow is a geriatric psychiatrist with a private practice in New York City. She received her medical degree from Weill Cornell Medicine and completed her general psychiatry residency and geriatric psychiatry fellowship at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Weill Cornell Medicine. Prior to starting her private practice, she worked as a full-time assistant professor of clinical psychiatry and attending psychiatrist at this institution. She's also provided consultation services as the geriatric psychiatrist on New York City Elder Abuse Center's Queens Enhanced Multidisciplinary Team. In addition, she received an Executive Master of Business Administration from Columbia Business School. And that's the intros. So I thought we would start by each of us say something about your work or what you're working on, and how you came to be.
Could you please raise your voice?
I can't. It's up to. Well, I could raise it. Can I raise it? Does that happen? Does that work? So the sound is no good back there.
Well, it depends what direction.
Okay.
Yeah, right, just take it off then and just talk.
And how
loud.
you
It
came to
doesn't
be,
matter.
interested in this subject. And I'll just start with you.
Are we starting with me?
Is that all right?
No, that's totally fine. Let's see. Let me put it this way. I mean, I came to be interested in the subject of our conversation today through a couple of different angles. One of them is that I went through the quite common experience of having a parent become demented really right at the end of his life. He didn't experience a long trajectory of it. It was really in the last few weeks of his life. And I wrote about that. I published a long essay about really the last, I would say, 6 or 8 weeks of my father's life in the New Yorker in 2019, and had a lot of occasion to think about this topic. The other reason, though, is that I published a book this year, as Anne-Marie mentioned, about Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson died in 1882, and for the last 10 years of his life, he clearly was suffering from some kind of dementia, quite possibly Alzheimer's. That diagnosis did not exist, of course, at that point. It did not exist till 1906. But Emerson certainly had some form of it. And in addition to that, because he was a celebrity throughout much of his adult life, and specifically a celebrity who traveled the Lyceum lecture circuit in this country, he was observed quite a lot by a large public wrestling with these cognitive problems to a much greater extent than, say, an older person sitting by the hearth at home would have been. And so he often is cited as sort of one of the earliest dementia sufferers in the spotlight. And so there's an entire chapter in my book devoted to his struggles with that illness and the ways in which it's transformed some of his thinking in really quite fascinating ways. So that's what I'll say for now.
Thank you. Caitlin?
Hi. So I will say I have lost my voice as of this morning, so I will try to project and do my best. I started working with older adults actually when I was in middle school, and went to medical, had the idea that I wanted to go to medical school to work with older adults, and initially thought it would be in medicine, and then was very drawn to psychiatry. I'm from a family of psychiatrists, so it wasn't a shock to many, but that's kind of how I wound up in geriatric psychiatry. And I really have continued to be so drawn to it because of there are so many things that older adults experience that are, very similar. So it's a real chapter of life where there are themes that so commonly emerge, but then watching each individual face those in different ways and has been extraordinary, and being able to be a small part of those stories, especially in New York, where you encounter some of the most incredible people, has continued to make my work very interesting.
Okay.
Wendy?
I'm Wendy Sloan. I write poetry, so of course I have an interest in language. I was an English major. And I'm aging. so I'm now interested in aging poetry or poetry of aging or whatever. But more specifically, in terms of today. My companion of 55 years, my husband Jonathan Chasen, was diagnosed about 10 years ago with frontal temporal dementia or degeneration, which is what Bruce Willis now has brought to public consciousness. He passed away in May. So I went through about a decade of dealing with relating to him as he lost the ability to speak. He had primary progressive aphasia, very common with a lot of brain damage issues. And I've written a series of poems about his decline and some specifically about his relationship to language as it changed.
I'm Rachel Hadis. I'll speak loudly. I took off this contraption because I cannot deal with it, but I'll try to be audible. Am I audible?
Yes.
And I've been a poet for most of my life. I like Wendy aging. It's very unusual. Very few people age, but a couple of us here. My late husband, who taught music at Columbia, was diagnosed in late '04, early '05, in his early 60s, with what was never clearly diagnosed until a brain autopsy, which is not unusual. But with 20/20 hindsight, he began to show symptoms around 1999, and he died in 2011. And knowing zero about neurodegenerative diseases, my parents both died rather young and fully alert. It was a steep learning curve, but I learned a lot. I was teaching at Rutgers all the time, which was a blessing because there was so much verbal interchange in the classroom. And I was involved with support groups and was somewhat able to help Wendy and another person in the audience because I feel like I've become a de facto advisor, but it's an extraordinarily difficult path. I think I got more interested in poetry about dementia, but a great deal of wonderful poetry has been written just about aging, so I'm happy to talk about both. I don't want to take too much time, but obviously our society is aging, and I would love to learn more from Caitlin about exactly what she does, but happy to learn from everybody.
Hi, everyone. I'm Owen Lewis, a poet and a psychiatrist. I want to thank Ed and Anne-Marie for organizing this. And just personally, being here at New York Psychoanalytic, I have to remember my father-in-law, Jerry Ennis, who gave so much of his life to this institution. So how did I get interested in this? Quite by surprise, I found myself beginning, well, I should back up. You know, as one ages, one forgets a word or has to look a little longer for the word, misplacing things. And I began to dwell on that, like, what if, what if, what if? And I think, you know, what one loves motivates poetry, but what one fears sometimes motivates poetry. And what emerged was my last book, Knock Knock, which is a persona sequence of poems that follows a character into his dementia and loss of identity. It quite surprised me that I was writing about it, but there it is, and I began to think more about the poetry of aging and read more, and so I got here.
Well, I think many of us, not you two, are thinking about aging. in general, I've begun to think about it. Well, we should be talking about poetry as well. I was going to say, at any point, if anyone would like to read a poem of their own or someone else's, that would be great, as well as we can talk about the poetry of aging. Also, anybody have anything come to mind?
Who wants? Do you want to go first?
What?
You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I wanted to say that James's book on Emerson, which I haven't finished, is the best book on Emerson I've ever read.
well, thank
hands
you
down.
very much. I appreciate that.
I have a chapter in my memoir, and I will not read the whole chapter. I'm going to give a little background and read 2 poems from it, but a fairly recently discovered poem by Sappho. We've all heard of her. Short. Pursue the beautiful gifts of the violet muses, you children, and the high song-loving lyre. My skin was soft before, but now old age claims it. My hair's gone from black to white. My spirit has grown heavy. My knees can't hold me, though once they could dance light as fawns. I often groan, but what can I do? Being an ageless human is not possible. For they say rosy-armed dawn in love went to the ends of the earth holding Tithonus, beautiful and young, but in time gray old age seized him too, even with an immortal wife. Greek poetry really emphasizes physical beauty, but also mortality. And does everybody know the story of Tithonus? I don't know if Freud ever talks about it, but the goddess of dawn fell in love with a mortal called Tithonus, and she requested and received immortality for him so he could be her lover forever, but she forgot to ask for eternal youth. Whoops. And this is from the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, and it's just pretty short, and there are many, many translations. The Homeric hymns are religious poems from about the 7th century before the Common Era. They're not by Homer. And the context is that Aphrodite has fallen in love with a mortal man who she wants to make sure she doesn't make the same mistake that Eos made.
But there was a lot of that going around, clearly.
Yeah,
Falling in love with a mortal is
Right, I
occupational
know.
there's a
hazard.
lot of that.
So too, golden-throned Eos abducted Tithonus, one of your own race, the mortals, who resemble the immortals. She went to ask Cronion, lord of dark clouds, that he should be immortal and live forever. And Zeus nodded assent and fulfilled her wish. Mighty Eos was too foolish to think of asking youth for him and strip him of baneful old age. Indeed, so long as much coveted youth was his, he took his delight in early-born golden-throned Eos and dwelt by the stream of ocean at the ends of the earth. And this is what's really interesting. As he ages, she deals with it in different ways. But when the first gray hairs began to flow down from his comely head and noble chin, mighty Eos did refrain from his bed, though she kept him in her house and pampered him with food and ambrosia and gifts of fine clothing. Pretty interesting, huh? But when detested old age weighed heavy on him and he could move or lift none of his limbs, this is the counsel that to her seemed best in her heart. She placed him in a chamber and shut its shining doors.
Oh, that's nice.
And that word placed, you know, one of the euphemisms you learn is placement.
Right.
So I thought that this is really remarkable. And Tennyson has a beautiful poem called Tithonus, where Tithonus mournfully says, I'm getting older and older. And that's where Aldous Huxley got the title of his novel, After Many a Summer Dies the Swan. He's saying everything in nature dies, but I can't. And then the wonderful poet A.E. Stallings has a poem called Tithonus, where Eos is speaking like a person visiting their loved one in an institution and leaving. And then I have a poem of the same title. I won't even go into that now, but I'll start with that. This is a very old topic. But I think that our time is particularly squeamish about old age. And we are aging, and people are living a lot longer and more healthily than they used to. But there are unforeseen problems. I think I'd leave it at that.
Right.
Giving you a little historical background.
Are those translations you were reading, Rachel? Are they paraphrases, or what
The
were they?
translation of Sappho is by Diane Rayer, and the
Okay.
translation from the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite is by Apostolos Athanasakis. There are many translations.
Okay,
Yeah,
great,
sure.
thanks.
I will respond for a second. I loved those poems, but I think talk about this all the time, where there's a shift in social hierarchies as people get older, where often social worth is contingent on level of functioning. And so what you were talking about of this what if, it's also, will I lose all of my relationships? Will I have a place at the table? Will I remain relevant to the people that love? Will I remain recognizable to myself? to those around me. And there's this, often I hear about and see either a fear of or an actual return to exclusivity that people experienced earlier in life, where all of a sudden, they're not part of the conversation. People are making decisions on their behalf, and there's an invisibility to it. That's terrifying. And there are these quiet tragedies that they encounter in their day-to-day life when they experience, something about their age, difficulty getting up, pain, groaning, what you described, which is so typical, a slower speed or a name loss, and it feels like terror.
That's interesting. So a return to childhood in a certain way.
But this, I do, exclusivity happens, in all different times and places in life, but I think there is, more of it in childhood. You see it so much. It's, kids, I have young children, they're always very, quick to say who they want to play with and who they don't, and they tell each other. But then, later in life, I, have a wonderful person who I'm treating who had what she described as a real trauma of going to her weekly canasta game, and it was a number of people, and there was no seat for her. And she had this realization, and she, does have a slowing of her processing, but a realization of who she imagined to be her friends no longer wanted to play with her. But there's so many moments like this that come up.
And that wasn't an accident, or it was?
I don't, it's...
I get that she's
The other thing about memory is they're not,
Yeah.
fixed, fact-based accounts, so it was her perception. But there wasn't a, come sit with us, we'll team up.
Right.
There was, we have our groups, we got here early, we took our seats.
What exactly do you mean by
That's not very
exclusivity?
nice.
In social groups. So
Meaning being excluded?
Yeah.
being excluded.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, I was a little confused by that.
Yeah.
Seems kind of,
Yeah, well, I was thinking some of my, the poems that immediately come to mind are, of course, Dylan Thomas, Do Not Go Gently Into That Good Night, and that's, of course, the son urging the father to fight against the inevitable. I was wondering if you all thought, I mean, there is in the second stanza, the wise men at their end know dark is right, but he still wants his father to fight. I was just wondering whether you thought that was good advice for the father.
I think a lot of people do rage against the dying of the light.
Yeah.
That poem feels not that relevant. I'm not sure. There are people who dislike that poem because
I can
I
understand.
would like to know how the father feels.
Well,
Right.
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
What
yeah,
what is it for the father?
Yeah, and we don't know.
No, of course not. and Thomas knows that dark is right at the end, but he still feels it's about Dylan Thomas. It's not about his father really. And the other poem I like very much is Stanley Kunitz, one of your favorites, right?
Right.
It's called Touch Me. It's not about terrible, really old age, but
No, I have it here.
you have. Well,
I could read it,
I
but
know
also-
that you can read it too, but the two the parts that I think of are the end of the poem is touch me, remind me who I am, which could apply, of course, at any age, and the other is what makes the engine go, desire, desire, desire.
Right.
And I thought that's also ageless, but for someone at 65 to write it, I think he was about 65, somewhere between 65 and 70, is great, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, because Kunitz, I think, lived to be 99 or 100 years old.
100.
And was writing, maybe not right at the end, but very close to the end of his life. And I think that also raises the interesting question of what age and increasing incapacity, gradual, let's say, incapacity, will do to a poet, to the writing of poetry.
Yes.
You know, and Yeats as well is another great example of someone, he didn't live to be as old as Kunitz, but who lived long enough to write very eloquently about old age. I actually just lost a very good friend, not a poet, but an amazing fiction writer, Laurie Siegel, And
Yeah.
she was 96, and she was writing almost until the moment of her death. And it's quite unusual, actually, to have someone be cogent enough and at the top of their game into their mid-90s to be writing about that experience, because there are a limited number of counts of that experience written by people who are in the middle of it. But I mean, Yeats and Kunitz are other
I think
wonderful
Kunitz
examples.
felt he was aging. He didn't know he was going to live to 100.
No, of course.
And,
Of course.
He was pretty good almost at the end even.
Yeah.
But
I'm
yeah.
not saying he wasn't sufficiently old enough at 65
no,
to write about aging.
I'm just saying that's how he felt. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's an unusual poem written by a poet that is not that well known now, Walter Savage Landor, who was a Victorian literateur, and I'm not sure how old he was, but he did have dementia at the end of his life, but he wrote a poem about having dementia. Mm-hmm. And this is in a wonderful anthology that Harold Bloom edited called Till I End My Song, A Gathering of Last Poems. And many of them are by people who I think were mentally fine.
Yeah.
Or maybe they weren't even that old, but they were looking ahead to death. But I won't read the whole Landor poem. It's called Memory, but he's complaining that memory has left him, but he still wants to write poems. And then he says at the end, a blessing wert thou, O oblivion, if thy stream carried only weeds away, but vernal and autumnal flowers alike it hurries down to wither on the strand. That's so terrific. If only I could lose my bad memories and keep the good ones, but I'm losing all of them. Mm-hmm. And then there are writers like Iris Murdoch and maybe Agatha Christie who probably had undiagnosed dementia, and it shows in their late work. Mm-hmm. I can't think of any poets like that, but I'm sure there are.
Well, I think Iris Murdoch's was diagnosed as some form of dementia.
Oh, it was,
Yeah,
but I
yes.
think people said, oh, that's why her last book doesn't make sense.
Oh.
Or
Yeah. I mean, and then there's the case of, let's say, someone like Willem de Kooning. I mean, there's a whole
Yes.
big argument going on
oh, yeah.
to this moment about whether the paintings that emerged from the end of his life when he did struggle with dementia, to what extent are those paintings evidence of some kind of impairment? The counter-argument being that much of his genius as a painter by then inhered in a kind of muscle memory almost, and that, of course, he could still paint without a sort of executive function. And I'm bringing up these examples not because they don't close the argument, they open the argument in
Yeah,
a way.
well, he did paint till the end,
very
as far
end.
as I know, yeah. And I'm sure the paintings were in some way influenced by what was going on, but, they weren't any less.
But I
His
wonder
painting.
if there's muscle memory with poetry.
I think there is. I think there must be. Don't you think so?
I don't know.
With
probably.
writing poetry?
You know, I don't know if any of you knew Peggy Penn. She only published two.
I know who she was.
Her husband was Arthur Penn, the filmmaker, and she was a social worker, worked a lot actually in writing and family systems. Towards the end, she became quite, she had lost significant memory. You could hardly talk with her, and yet she continued in her writing to be able to write some truly magnificent poems. I'm sorry I didn't bring any of her poems, but they weren't specifically about aging, because it was about her grandchildren, her life, but very vivid. And such a command of language in her writing, and yet not in conversation.
So interesting.
That's very
It
interesting.
was really remarkable.
Well, probably different
Yeah.
parts of your
That's
brain,
kind of
right?
surprising.
It sort of like reminds me of, stroke victims who may be completely aphasic for speech do retain the ability to recall lyrics when singing, and also the ability to curse. And it made me wonder if
But
her poetry was coming from that part that remembers the lyrics of singing. Because
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
yeah,
I also imagine that writing is so much, it requires so much precision, and then poetry also so much creativity, And maybe when she wasn't confronted with the, being in front of somebody else and the speed and, having to defer
You
to
like
social
that?
norms and all of the other noises, she could kind of play and be creative and be precise and access something.
Talking about singing, this being such a wonderful fall day, I was thinking of Keats's To Autumn, and I just want to read the last stanza. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them. Thou hast thy music too. Actually, I don't even need to read more of that. Thou hast thy music too. Which I think she was remembering the music, but I think that's the wonderful thing of poetry, that it celebrates the music of a stage of life. Yeah.
I'd like to read a poem or two about my husband. This, though it seems to me there's a big difference between remembering a song or lyric and actually being able to compose it, but which I'm sort of surprised that somebody could compose it. But
I don't know how she did it.
Yeah.
It was truly remarkable.
Okay, well, this one is on that subject exactly. Jonathan, lost but to song. Can I reach you anymore? You rarely say a word, but let me strike your favorite score and suddenly you'll be heard singing with a voice so strong, so sure, so loud, so clear as though your former self, long gone, were truly wholly here. And will you sing when winter's furs rattle the window pane? Still sing when February stirs the maple sap again? If you were to endure the while to meet another spring, I will be here to catch your smile and wait to hear you sing. So that was a situation where he was in speech therapy up until the time he died. And of course they use, well, not of course, but if you're familiar with the kind of therapy they do with people with aphasia, they use a lot of song. And people remember songs that they learned when they were children, are able to sing them, or parts of them. And that's a way they kind of help people hang on to some language for as long as possible. I have another one that's on another subject. Rachel asked me to read it. It's kind of, well, I'll read it to you. This was earlier in the progression of his, but still at a point where he was no longer saying more than a word or two. It's called Word. Then came the year you kept repeating, Wendy, till you had but a single greeting, Wendy. Your world reduced to just one proper noun for anyone you chanced on meeting, Wendy. Each thing you saw, each thing you touched, for every phrase you were completing, Wendy. Though I was pleased that you still knew my name alone, this soon proved self-defeating, Wendy being the only way you had of naming, being, that is, a form of cheating Wendy and everyone else to get by. All day, your sole response, incessant bleating, Wendy. And when you stopped, you'd no more names at all. Now I could shake you, plead, entreating, Wendy. So it's
That's
another.
beautiful.
Thank you. It's another phase we went through, kind of a sad phase, but his speech therapist, who actually came to his memorial, mentions it a lot. She says, remember that time when you used to just say your name all the time for everything? Everything was Wendy. So I don't know what the psychiatrists have to say about that, but...
Right. And what I have to say is I agree, they're beautiful poems. And, beautiful about, the experience and the relationship and, how you related to it in, what I imagine was all of these series of losses for you and, also access and how connected you were.
I just have a question asked out of complete ignorance. So aphasia means inability to speak as far as or to respond verbally. But does something else, but are thoughts going on inside that they cannot speak?
That's the question. And I remember when relatively early on, I asked his doctor, who was a neuropsychiatrist, who actually specializes in FTD. His name's Dr. Huey. He's now at Brown, but he was at Columbia at the time. And we went to visit him in person. At that time, we saw him in person. Jonathan was able to, walk around, go places, function better. But he already wasn't speaking really well. And then, we went through the whole session. He really wasn't able to participate in terms of speaking. And then towards the end, he said something like kind of right on point, like, okay, let's get out of here, or something like this. And I said to Dr. Huey, now see that? He does that. All of a sudden, he'll say something right on point. And does he he knows what he's doing. Does he know what he's doing? And Dr. Huey said, nobody knows. Nobody knows what's going on in his mind, really. It's impossible to say.
But, I mean, it does seem that a very frequent characteristic of dementia is simply the loss of vocabulary. The shrinking of vocabulary is very, very common. Now, whether some of that vocabulary remains inside but somehow cannot be accessed is a different question. But, first of all, I have a 92-year-old mother, and I, particularly in the last year or two, I very much observed this, much more groping for language, much more use of workarounds. And, when I was doing my research on Emerson, and I spent 10 years on and off writing the book, you do become very intimate with that person after that many years of deep immersion in their journals, their diaries, and their life. And, and in the accounts of his going through the early stages of dementia, everything was so recognizable and so contemporary in the sense that his vocabulary started to shrink. He started to use the workarounds that are so recognizable to anybody who has dealt with an aging parent or even observing it in themselves. He called his dressing gown the red chandelier. He called the umbrella the thing that is taken away, which made me feel like, so people have been stealing umbrellas for centuries now. That's not a new development. And all of it was so familiar. And this was someone going through this, in 1870 or so. But obviously, for a writer, the encroaching loss of language is a tragedy on another level, on top of what it would be for anybody else. And that was, what seemed to me tragic in an intense study of this person's life. That someone who lived for language and was undoubtedly one of the amazing voices in American culture had his primary currency being taken away, really on a word-by-word basis. The thing that makes me wonder afresh whether a lot more of the vocabulary remained inside but could not be articulated anymore is that he couldn't write at all in the last decade of his life, but he continued to read. And I had a really interesting experience when I was doing an event for the book at the Concord Free Public Library, and one of the people came up to me and said, we have his record of the stuff he took out of the library during the last few years of his life, and they printed it out because, of course, it's all in their database. It's very peculiar to get a computer printout of the stuff the person took out of the library in 1870. And there were novels by Dickens, novels by Elizabeth Gaskell, some biographies, and I was fascinated to think that this person who really had to limit his public appearances and was quite frank about his inability to speak with other human beings now, could still read. And I don't know what that says ultimately about what vocabulary still remained inside, but clearly something did, unless he was content to sort of read through the book in a much more groping way with a lower level of understanding, but still a pleasure at what he was getting from it.
Do you know how old he was when he wrote Terminus? That's a wonderful
He was
poem.
is that in there?
Yeah.
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah,
He was in his 60s, and he read that poem to his very shocked son, Edward Emerson, in a New York City hotel room. And he was about to embark on another tour of the Midwest, another speaking tour. And his son was rather shocked. It's a poem about getting old.
Was he all right at that time still?
Yes, this was still pretty early in this cycle. I mean, he did not have the earmarks of dementia yet, but he sensed in himself an ebbing of his powers, certainly of his creative powers. And so I mean, he was still in the midst of a very busy lecture career, but he shared this poem with his son, whose basic, I think reaction was, "What do you mean, Dad? You're about to do your 30-city rock star tour of the Midwest." But he sensed it in himself, a kind of mental shutting down. And there are many very touching lines in that poem, actually.
Just to begin, it begins, "It is time to be old, to take in sail. The god of bounds who sets to seas ashore came to me in his fatal rounds and said, 'No more.'"
Right.
I mean, and we're living at a time when people are very reluctant often to retire from public life or from whatever they're doing.
Right.
This is a wonderful poem in that sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Caitlin, is there any research that would indicate whether language is actually preserved and inaccessible, or it's actually lost? I mean, is it a question of access, as James asked, or is it a question of actually loss of language? Is there any research that highlights that?
There's just, when we say dementia, it's such an umbrella term.
Exactly.
And Alzheimer's is the most common, but it is every different thing. So there are certainly, people who have experienced strokes and they hit one part of the brain and not another. So they have, they're able to comprehend but not express. And then there's every variety of it. So there's, I think what your neuropsychiatrist said is often the case. We don't know. I get the question all the time with, caregivers, is this how they've always felt about me? Is this their personality coming out? If someone's expressing aggression or, dislike, or is it a symptom of dementia? We don't know. Usually I say it's probably a symptom of dementia if it's negative, but, so no specific research that I know of to speak to that, but certainly there would be types of dementing illnesses where somebody could comprehend, read, but be unable to express or write. And I would imagine also there are some psychological implications to that where, you could, this is, of course we have no idea, but if you're a writer and that's your profession and you decide you no longer write at the level that you are used to or would like to, you may still be able to write, but opt to just read.
You mentioned Dickens. I mean, there are characters in Dickens who clearly have one form of dementia or another, even though the language wasn't there for it. There's a character in David Copperfield who's obsessively writing what's called a memorial. He keeps writing a memo to the government about King Charles I's head being cut off, and he can't seem to stop. And they give him money to jingle in his pockets so he feels prosperous. And David, who's a child, asks his aunt, who's the caregiver, "Is Mr. Dick at all mad?" And so this 10-year-old child recognizes it. And there's other characters in Dickens. And I think when I began to be teaching and my husband was clearly ailing with something, I felt as if I was recognizing here and there in what I was reading examples that went way back of this kind of altered behavior.
Oh, yeah, it's certainly always been there. And I mean, in the case of Emerson, again, because he was such a public figure, there were many, many explanations for his changing affect. And maybe, many friends said he's withdrawn into sort of a Platonic wonderland, an idealistic wonderland, or into he's retrogressed in a way into a kind of beautiful childhood. Because in some sense, they didn't have the language or the diagnoses yet. Also life expectancy was shorter then. So many fewer people survived into the age where there would be a large population to observe. So there were many excuses made and interpretations made of someone who was dealing with that. And obviously in Dickens too, just that you were a colorful eccentric in a way. And that wasn't so bad in the sense that no one was mistreating that character. They were in a sense accommodating that character's reality. But again, in the case of Emerson, his family who took care of him knew what was going on, and they dealt with, again, the very familiar phenomena of like the lost wallet, and the lost watch. And Emerson saying somewhat heartbreakingly to his wife near the end of his life, "Who was my best friend?"
Oh, right.
And his wife would say to him, it was Henry David Thoreau. And he would say, "Oh, right." And that's very touching and very heartbreaking to read about. But a lot of these experiences obviously have to do with the environment you're in and how you are being accommodated by the people who love you or don't.
And then you don't know, has he forgotten Thoreau, or has he forgotten his name?
That's a very good question, too.
But there's different, different kinds of dementia, of course, different kinds of brain damage to different parts of the brain, as Caitlin was saying. And I think there's also just the brain shrinks with age. Isn't that so to a certain extent? Or
To a certain extent, yeah. And more so with other psychiatric illnesses, but
more so when you have psychiatric illnesses, yeah, okay.
When you look at depictions of dementia not named in literature, you also see side-by-side caregiving modes.
Yes.
I
Oh,
mean,
that's
this eccentric in David Copperfield is living with a relative of his who's very protective. And then there's another less benign, demented lady who will sort of more a Tourette's thing. I mean, she screams out inappropriate things, but she lives with her nephew. So you get to see how these things work.
I mean, King Lear had some good caregivers and some bad caregivers. So I think it's very much luck of the draw, and it's tragic when there is not a sympathetic party there, obviously.
I often see that as well with caregivers, where the pre-morbid relationship has to support the extent of the sacrifice. And they have to have sufficient resources and a sense of mission. And if those things don't all line up, it can be extraordinary in terms of the burden and intensity of the experience.
And I mean, in the case of my father's difficulties, I mentioned before, he was a scientist who was diabolically devoted to his career and running his lab, and he was cogent really until he died at 89. He was cogent until the last, let's say, 2 months of his life. In retrospect, it seems that he may have had a subdural hematoma that was accounting for some of his cognitive problems. He began to hallucinate. There was I don't know exactly where the dividing line between hallucinating and confabulation is, but he would recount experiences that actually had their own, sometimes sad, poignant poetry to them. I mean, once he had already been, he was eventually admitted to a hospital because of these hallucinations and things like that. There was a happy hope that they could relieve the subdural hematoma, which he had started to fall down a lot. And basically the theory was maybe he had fallen down and struck his head, and that there was a swelling in there that was now exerting some pressure on the brain. And of course, we always hoped that there was a mechanical fix.
Right.
And they did indeed do a procedure with a drainage, and that did not solve the problem. But while he was in the hospital, we went there one morning, and he said, a man in a brown suit came to visit me at my bedside, and it had been an upsetting encounter because the man in the brown suit had insisted that he was my father. And my father was disturbed by it, and I think actually was experiencing some uncertainty as, well, what if that guy was him? And it was such a poignant expression of confusion about identity, and I think an anticipation of loss of self. But it was a poetic expression of that at the same time. And he had a few of them, along with the rather more common, mild paranoia of, I'm being held prisoner in the hospital, everybody here is an imposter, I need you to fetch the director of the hospital so I can fill him in on what's going on. Yeah. And because I was new to this, in other words, because this whole experience had been accelerated into a very short space and I was not a veteran, I didn't yet understand that you had to meet people where they were in a case like this. And I said to him, Dad, you're being taken care of here. These are good people, and I can't fetch the director. And he said, my own son won't do this favor to me. And sadly, that was really the last cogent conversation that we had. It was very difficult.
That loss of identity, I think, is a very frightening aspect. As I've observed patients through dementia and sort of imagine the trajectory, the way I worked with it in my book, when the character's daughter leaves him in a care home, she says, don't take off your name tag. And he wants to follow so exactly that every time he imaginatively sends his shirt to the laundry, he leaves the name tag on, and the name tag is progressively obliterated. Well, finally he meets another woman, and when he says, "Who are you?" she points to her name tag, and there's no name tag left, but it concludes, but they become good friends. You know, recognizing that there's something that can happen even without identity. There's some preservation. But I think that's a very what you were talking about with your father, very terrifying aspect. Who are we, you know, once
And he wouldn't have
lose these
articulated
focus.
that way, but clearly this great fear was
Right.
coming to the surface.
Right,
there.
and that another person could be him,
Yes.
you know, in his confabulation. And you won't fix that. What kind of son were you? You couldn't fix that, right?
I mean,
No,
you don't
what a
get-
burden, you know.
don't get a do-over, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
I mean, you know, but I mean, now I have a 92-year-old mother, and I understand much better how to deal with her sort of confusions and memory lapses. And again, confabulations that are quite fascinating sometimes as narratives, even though I know that she is she is putting in a stopgap to try to explain a reality that she cannot grasp rationally. And they're sometimes very inventive and have a poetry of their own.
Absolutely.
But, you know, I don't know what to extent she is nervous about the loss of herself. But yeah, that's a live one for not just for an artist, but for a human being.
Mm-hmm.
But Caitlin, this hospital-induced psychosis, they have a different name for it now.
Well,
But it's a specific, a lot of people get that in when they're institutionalized or hospitalized, right? They,
Yes.
and
The
then they get,
paranoia that I was mentioning.
right,
Yeah.
and then they get better afterwards, or they,
so delirium
delirium, right?
is distinct from dementia in terms of it's an acute confusional state that often gets better, although some people have more of a terminal delirium where, you know, in their last weeks to months, they remain delirious.
Right.
But yes, it is distinct from dementia, but, you know, shares many qualities.
Yeah, my in-laws were very anti-authoritarian personalities, and every time they were hospitalized, they totally wigged out.
Yeah.
Especially my father-in-law. I mean, remember, he was like, you know, he would be sitting there with him, and they actually had to restrain him. They had a person guarding him. They had him tied up, and you'd go visit him, and he'd say, "Hey, got a knife?" And then you'd talk a little while longer. Then he'd say, "Hey, got a match?" It was just, but he always recovered when he came home. So it was just, you know, it was almost funny because it's so typical of his basic anti-authoritarian personality. He just couldn't deal with institutions at all.
You make me wonder, does a sense of humor survive any of the stuff we're talking about? Or is
He didn't.
he wasn't being funny.
He didn't
You're
have.
making
He
it
didn't
funny.
have dementia. He just became. He had
Delirious.
delirium when he was
He was
hospitalized,
non-compliant.
and he was very non-compliant.
Well,
He
my
would try to
gran-
escape.
I'm asking because, I don't know, but my grandmother she had some Parkinson's and she'd had a series of little strokes, but she was a little bit. She said she was in a wheelchair, but she was perfectly healthy, and she knew about 6 languages, and she started saying things in all of those languages at once. You know, the sentence would start in one language and move around. The only person who could understand her was my mother, but what she was saying made perfect sense. It was just in 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 languages, and her personality changed, and she began to make cracks about people. Now, this is a woman who you were not allowed to say anything negative about anybody during her lifetime. But when this happened, she started to make cracks about people. They were humorous. She developed a sense of humor.
Right. So like that. And I'm sure the psychiatrist, this like lowering of inhibitions. What do they call that? Not being able to control.
Disinhibition.
A lowering of
Right,
inhibitions
that's-
for sure.
yeah,
Right.
But it made sense. You know, if you were willing to go there with her, it was not.
It makes sense.
This is sort of off the topic of poetry, but everybody knows that caregiving for somebody who is suffering from one of these diseases, especially at home, is terribly difficult. And there's a tremendous secondary literature about caregiving, probably more than about these diseases. I don't know how much progress is being made more toward diagnosis than toward cure, I think, unfortunately. So there's a book someone was recommending to me whose partner has Alzheimer's called Contented Dementia. And the idea is keep the person contented by agreeing with everything they say and meeting them where they are. And I just wanted to say that's extremely difficult. And there's a
Won't work all the time.
I know someone, and he's extremely contented. When he comes to see me every 2-3 months, his family wants him to come, I'm a psychiatrist, to come and see me. And he says, I say, how are things? He says, I'm fine. Everything is fine. If I don't say anything, I can't figure out how much he remembers, doesn't remember what he knows, what he doesn't know. What I notice is he has very little of his old caring. So if I ask about his wife, who passed away 4 years ago, yeah, he had a wife who passed away. If I ask about his children, they're fine. Everybody's fine. And if I dig, he has more memory than shows. Otherwise, all he will show is, everything is fine, I'm fine. He looks,
Well, I guess that's good.
He looks completely contented. There's somebody taking care of him, they feed him, he sits down, watches TV, and he's happy.
Does he have a diagnosis? I mean, do you know what's supposed to be?
He just has no specific diagnosis.
No specific
He has dementia.
diagnosis.
He's 90 years old.
Oh, it's quite old.
But there isn't, I mean, some people get agitation and impulsivity. It's just like
Yeah, some people become very violent, and you know, then you
I
can't.
have a question for the two of you. Given that you were thrust into caretaking roles, and you mentioned a literature about caregiving, how about, I know there's a huge literature in poetry on caregiving. Was there anything you particularly learned from poems on caregivers?
Poems on caregivers.
Well, you mentioned narrative medicine, which
Yeah.
I sort of got catapulted into that field as well. And I think writing as a caregiver, no matter what you write, is going to be therapeutic. It's always good. And sharing and support groups, I believe in all that. The only answer that comes to mind is metaphor and simile are helpful. Because it's very hard to talk about otherwise this invisible, insidious disease. So, I mean, Cavafy has a poem called Walls about, I wasn't paying attention, but they were building walls outside my house. And I
Right.
doubt if he wrote it with dementia in mind, but you begin to read things differently.
Right.
And I found that very helpful. Shakespeare, one of Shakespeare's sonnets begins, "Why didst thou promise such a beauteous day and make me travel forth without my cloak?" And it's not a meteorological gripe, it's that things, the weather, the emotional weather changed. And I know that you can begin a day with a person with dementia and think, this is going to be a good day. Or they're maybe a little better than they were yesterday, but that's not the case. And I think poetry tells the truth. Now, I mean, distinguishing between poems written by caregivers who are struggling and great poems. I don't mean caregivers never write great poems, but you know,
Right, right.
if you look at the canon of poetry, there's a lot that's applicable, I think,
Yeah.
if that
Right.
answers your question.
No, but I just wondered anything particularly jump out.
No, I don't have anything
Tell the
particular.
truth,
Well,
if you can.
right. Or, as Emily Dickinson said, tell it at a slant.
tell
There is option B, of course.
Option B.
No, slant.
Tell it at a slant.
You have a friend who.
Yeah, I
wrote
mean,
a
I
book
was,
about
I
that.
was thinking just now, I mean, I have a friend named Dasha Kipper. She wrote a book called Travelers in Unimaginable Lands, and that is a book that is very much about the psychic and neurological strains of being a long-term
I
caregiver.
just lent it to someone in the
Yeah, I mean,
audience.
it's a remarkable book. I mean,
It's a very good book.
she worked both training caregivers and sometimes directly with Alzheimer's patients. So really, her focus is on the caregiver, and a lot of her argument in the book is the way in which the human brain is not set up to deal with some of the psychic strains that come about from intense long-term caregivers.
I think she was caregiving for her own mother as well. That comes up.
She wasn't caregiving for her own mother, but she spent a year caregiving. She moved in with a 97-year-old man when she was in her 20s, who was very, very late stage, and she wrote a remarkable piece about it, which appeared in The American Scholar, and then eventually it led to this book. But the book is quite fascinating, specifically about the, again, psychic and almost neurological strains undergone by caregivers. She's not so much discussing, you learn what is going on in each case, and some of them are quite strange and colorful and inventive challenges for a caregiver. But it's really about what happens to the brain of the caregiver, floundering and trying to adjust to like a 24/7 reality that your brain is not designed to cope
It's
with.
a very good book.
It's
what's the book
wonderful.
called?
I would.
It's called Travelers to Unimaginable Lands, Dasha Kipper, K-I-P-E-R.
okay.
Excellent book.
Yeah.
I was recommending it to Anne-Marie, and I think it's kind of a curative for books with titles like Contented Dementia, or the first book on Alzheimer's I found when I began to look had a really cheerful title, The 36-Hour Day.
Okay.
Oh, good, I want to buy that book.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
fun.
No, her book is it's not sort of a how-to or manual,
Right.
but it is a kind of meditation by a very knowledgeable person on the challenges of the mental challenges of coping for a caregiver.
yeah.
And there's many examples drawn from literature and obviously from literature, and then obviously from the scientific literature.
Some of
Interesting.
the caregiving poetry that I think about, Martha Rhodes' Night Mother, Ellen Dory Watson, I forget the title of her book, but about caring for her mother. Gail Thomas, poet who lives in Northampton. Very, very moving accounts of the struggle and the fears.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
Well, three come to mind. I only remember the title, Martha Rhodes' Night Mother, but Ellen Dory Watson, I could Google her titles, has a wonderful book about her mother's dementia. And Gail Thomas, it's interesting, her book is a sequence of sonnets, and I think she needed to find some structure for what was so unstructured in that experience. And the sonnet, of course, they get a little scrappy, but did that for her in that
I
book.
think the other thing, to answer your earlier question, Owen, is that poetry allows us to speak to no one in particular, almost like a prayer. And my husband became very unresponsive in every way. It was extremely lonely.
So you needed to speak.
So not only did I write a poem about loneliness, but I thought, who are my poems to? And indeed, who are we writing for when we write poems? So in that sense, poetry is very well calculated to the role of the caregiver.
Right. Do you have that poem?
I probably have a lot more than one. I'll read the loneliness one.
Yeah.
I was interested to learn that through a narrative medicine conference I went to, the conference at the University of Iowa?
Yes.
Okay, so I met there a doctor who was a bush physician in Australia, and apparently his group of doctors used poetry to blow off steam, to vent about their difficult patients. And then I learned that also some doctors or some judges in Australia put my loneliness poem on their website. I thought there must be a lot of loneliness in Australia. And of course there's loneliness everywhere. And so if you're speaking the truth about something that's difficult, it's going to apply to different people.
Of course.
So it's, okay, loneliness. Love costs anxiety, joy has a price, the fragile edge and smoky smell of limits. Loneliness lacks any such suggestion of an end. It is forever and plentiful beyond imagining. Whatever realm it comes from boasts a supply not only infinite but constantly increasing. This is one resource we need not fear will be depleted, nor do we need to doubt that anyone who once has tasted loneliness will ever forget its special savor. Now, that's a pretty grim poem, and it was written at a time when I was lonelier than I am now, but I did think about it at the time that loneliness seems inexhaustible when you're lonely. It goes with you, it travels with you. So, and I think caregivers are lonely by definition.
One thing I've been thinking about as I've been listening to everyone is just how poetry is a place to find companionship. And,
Oh, yeah.
you know, if there isn't access to the outside world or social ties in the way we once had it, that, you know, you can really look to literature and art.
But, you know, I would say that so is painting, so is making music or writing it.
Sure.
All those things. If
All the
I don't,
arts.
I'm not, you know, if I'm painting, it's not for someone. It's to see, actually, it's to find out how I feel or think. That's really, I know that's been said before about a lot of things, but more than poetry, although poetry has done that too. But, you know,
There's a Boston-based photographer, I believe her name is Olivia Parker, and she documented her husband's Alzheimer's with a remarkable series of photographs. I mean, he was a businessman, and then she would have a series of photographs of the paper clips he brought home or the Post-it notes, and, you know, each one became more illegible. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if I had been a musician or a carpenter or whatever instead of a poet, I hope I would have found some other outlet. I do think poetry is well suited to the loneliness and the verbal blockage of a lot of kinds of dementia. You want to share your story. And Wendy's Wendy poem is so terrific because she uses the form of a ghazal or a ghazal, which
Ghazal.
repeats the end word over and over. So she's able to use a poetic form in this very eloquent way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I mean, as you say, it's language and poetry is paradoxically matched to dementia as a topic, simply because dementia often is the subtraction and sometimes what seems like the extinction of language in the person who's suffering.
or creating a new language that
Yeah,
seems,
well,
like,
or
that seems
that-
like a nonsense language to us, but
Yeah, no, of course. Or speaking the multiple languages at once, as you were alluding to before.
But mentioning the form, I didn't pick up that it was a ghazal, but you know, that tension between form and formlessness and using at times somewhat received forms and watching them break down, recouping them, I mean, is one way in which I think poetry can capture
yeah.
this moving in and out of organization, right? And structure. When you started it, you probably didn't, the ghazal probably emerged as you were writing that poem.
Absolutely not.
No?
No.
You went
No.
right into it, huh?
Yeah, I thought, you know, the repetitive nature of the form would be the perfect vehicle for expressing what I had to say. I write a lot in form. In fact, almost exclusively. And which form it is just, you know, obviously has a lot to do with what I'm trying to do, you know, what I'm trying to accomplish, what I'm trying to say.
But what's so wonderful about that poem, the form doesn't hit you on the head. You know,
Oh,
you
no,
just listen
hopefully
to it as the poem, and it's a discovery afterwards that in fact you were writing in a form.
Oh,
And I
thanks.
think
Yeah,
that's
that's
the
good.
most wonderful
But
use
the
of a
form
form.
was the engine for
Yes.
the poem.
The form is still the engine,
It's
yeah,
like
the
what
form
John
can be an
Ashbery said
engine.
about Sestinas. He said it's like riding a bicycle downhill. The pedals push your feet. You've got the end words, and then
Right.
all you have to do is fill in the line. And that's easier when you're dealing with a difficult subject.
But he often rode downhill without the bicycle. I mean, he was also a great master of formlessness of a
Absolutely.
kind.
No, I
So,
know.
yeah. But the point remains, yes.
Everybody should know that a periodical that's now 20 years old called Bellevue Literary Review, which was started by Danielle Ofri, who's a physician, is really dedicated to poetry, nonfiction, prose, whether by caregivers or by patients or by doctors. And, you know, some of it, frankly, is kind of undigested trauma.
Yes.
But even undigested trauma, I believe, is a good thing for the person to write. It's better than nothing. You know, I think Philip Larkin, who was very negative, said, or someone said, even the most negative poem is a very good thing to do. It's better-
Larkin said that?
I think so.
And he also said start afresh, afresh, afresh. So he saw the value of renewal as well, but he was quite a negative man, yes, of
But
course.
it's better than
Well-
taking a gun and shooting somebody because you feel angry. You
I'd
know.
say it's 10 times better, yes.
Wow.
Or threatening to do so.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, because we sort of touched on this whole idea of the self earlier, like, I would be interested in backing up the conversation a little bit because, I mean, to return to I think one reason I spent all those years in the company of Emerson, aside from him being a fascinating person, is that he was fascinated with the idea of the self and what it was. And in fact, came out of an immersion in a philosophical tradition that included German idealism on one side and the British empiricists like Hume and Locke and Berkeley on the other side, all of whom were wrestling quite energetically with what the self was and arguing with each other about it. And to some extent wondering, was the self a kind of self-created illusion, and did the outside world exist? And I think all of these questions actually were sources of great fascination for Emerson, but also sources of anxiety. As a young man, he studied all these people. Someone like Berkeley, for example, you know, who basically said that the world out there is only created in a consciousness created by God, but essentially when you turn away, it's not there, except that it is sustained by God's perception of it. I think these were sources of great anxiety to Emerson, and stemmed partly from philosophical curiosity, but also from an intense sense of loneliness that he felt as a human being. And what that led to was a kind of bifurcated path of saying, on one hand, we're all individuals. I mean, his great doctrine of individualism, which he made a kind of American credo, and that we were alone in that sense. We were self-propelled, self-reliant human beings. But I think as a compensatory thing and as a form of comforting, he imagined this thing called the Oversoul, which was a communal consciousness that we were all part of. So we were all essentially alone and essentially connected at the same time. And for me, that ties into thinking about what happens when, in some sense, the self begins to leach away or bleed away. And of course, many people thinking about Alzheimer's would not say that, would say there is the self is still in there, but the access to it has waned in a very terrible and sad way. And I think even in Dasha Kipper's book that we discussed briefly before, she touched on some arguments in the literature that perhaps personality and self are more dispersed through the body and not simply exclusively in the parts of the brain where we say they are.
No, I think that's right. It's in the body. I mean, as in the Kunitz poem, the engine is desire, desire, desire. That's a felt state. It brought to mind a brief poem by Alicia Ostreicher, which I want to read, called Thirsting, which kind of touches on the same theme, where is the self, right? So it's called...
Yes.
So Thirsting, Alicia Ostreicher. It's not that the old are wise, but that we thirst for the wisdom we had at 20 when we understood everything, when our brains bubbled with tingling insight, percolating up from our brilliant genitals, when our music rang like a golden seed, shooting down all the lies in the world. Oh, then we knew the truth. Then we sparkled like mica in granite, and now we stand on the shore of an ocean that rises and rises. but is too salty to drink.
Nice.
I think that's just such a marvelous poem.
And, notice the metaphors, thirsty and salty.
Yes,
Ocean.
right.
I'm going to read a villanelle, speaking of form, called The Boat, and we all know the expression, we're in the same boat. So this is trying to be honest about what it's like living with somebody who's become, well, antisocial would be an understatement. All day I bustle in and out while you're at home. No, far away. All night we sail in the same boat. I think of trying to invite friends whom we no longer see. All day I'm busy, in and out. For you, the hours accumulate or fly by, maybe. Don't ask me. At night we sail in the same boat. The ties that bind have grown too tight. Entangled, you sit peacefully. I squirm and struggle to get out. Angry, impatient, or contrite, I stir the pot of poetry. At night we idle in our boat. To lose a self without a fight, you barely have a word to say. My mind's revolving in and out. Nights we sail blindly in our boat. And I don't think it's fair that I said to lose a self without a fight. There might have been a terrible fight.
Right.
There was just no audible fight. So I would revise that poem, or I would criticize that poem. But
So I think there must be questions from the audience.
Questions. Okay.
This would be a good time.
Any questions,
This-
you walk
yeah.
to the microphone there, and because otherwise we cannot. I'm sorry.
Actually, I just had two very brief comments. Long comments are horrible. One, I find it really interesting that so much of the discussion was about dementia when the description of the program beforehand, it was only one of about 4 aspects. I mean, just sitting here, one would have thought it's a program on dementia, and that's not a criticism, but I find that very interesting. And the other quick comment is the discussion on music and people who are lost. In case anybody hasn't seen it, there's a wonderful Oliver Sacks video. And if you just Google Oliver Sacks video, Henry Music, it's a guy who's totally into himself and what happens when music from his past is played. It's delightful.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I mean, I realize we did drift in that direction, and what hasn't been tapped really is the wisdom that actually can emerge with age, and celebrating that wisdom, and celebrating perspective, and celebrating lived history, and knowing what that, and there's so many poems that do celebrate that, but I do appreciate.
Well, I don't think it's just a binary between
No,
dementia and celebration.
No, it's not. But I'm just there are many things in between. But I'm
Just
just
the experience of aging if you're not demented.
yes.
No, agreed. I noticed this happening as I was inviting people,
Right.
or people were backing out, and I was inviting other people, that everyone's connection to aging seemed to be dementia. And I told Rachel, and I mentioned it to Caitlin, but that's the way it went,
Right.
so.
As I said, I wasn't
Yeah,
criticizing.
no.
But
it's okay.
but there's
But it
I want to say the first poem in my book is an imaginative exploration, but the title is How I Started to Use a Cane, and imagining, what it is to need a cane to walk with, and how many other canes that we reach for. So you're right. This is just how it went. But thank you for that comment.
One thing I would just add, based on that comment, it's a wise comment in that the actual incidence of dementia, I don't have exact numbers, but, before the 70s is low, 2.5-ish area, and then in the 70s up to 80s, you get to, a 5 to 10% prevalence, but still fairly low, and then, in the later 80s and 90s, you get up to 15 to 20%. So it's not the majority of how people age. And then one other thing I would add to kind of support what you were saying, there are a number of cohort studies that show a U shape of happiness, and it speaks to your poem also, where, youth, it's like the height of happiness, and then in midlife there's a decline, and then it comes back up. And so in older age, often, it's just, so they talk about the U-bend curve of happiness.
I'm dubious about that. I think in some ways, go ahead.
Anyone else wants to ask a question or make a comment? Please come. Come on.
Hello. Yes, so it's a very basic question, and maybe like one person who feels the most passionately could answer. But I figured I'd ask. So I'm the ripe old age of 26, and so there's still a lot of ways that I can take advice or try to take advice and forget about it. But what? Did it go out? Oh no. Okay. But just like a question, if anyone feels something strongly that when they were young, or 26, wish that they had done, or if you, and I don't even know if if it makes sense to think about that or how that works, but if anyone has any just thoughts on what a 26-year-old could do.
That's a bit of a stumper.
What are you doing?
One answer.
What am I doing? Well, right now, so I'm a software engineer, and I've been working really hard, but I'm taking a little bit of a break from work, and I'm trying to just focus on my friends and read. And try to get my life in order and also learn about the world.
I will answer. First of all, the fact that you asked that question makes me not worried about you. That you are doing the right things. So that's the first thing. The study that I like the most about this is called the Grant Study, and it looks at a group of men who graduated Harvard in 1938 to 1940, and it's a longitudinal study that's followed them, for 75 plus years, and tries to speak to what contributes to longevity, to a meaningful, happy life. And the lessons, fortunately, are really, warm, connected relationships, will help tremendously with that. Finding meaning in work over seeking recognition or money helps with longevity and aging. So it's really love over power, recognition, money. And you will likely get those other things if you focus on relationships.
I forget whose long-term cohort this was, but among the other aspects of things associated with contentment in old age was good relationships with your siblings. So that's something you could concentrate on.
Good relationships.
So I'll focus less on learning about this specific topic, even though I still like to do it, and I'll focus more on my friends.
Right.
Amazing. Thank
Yeah.
Oh, also, as a former Amazon employee, don't work for Amazon.
you. Yeah, no,
Okay.
Well done. I will say one other thing. Find something productive and meaningful to do and do it well, whatever it is.
Anyone else?
Anne, who asked that wonderful question and made those comments, sent me a great quote from Edith Wharton's memoir, which she wrote late in life, called A Backward Glance. Mm-hmm. And I'll just read the second paragraph, but it does have a lot to do with wisdom and how to live well and how to age well. And I think I think dementia is a big attention grabber. I mean, it has been for us, and because it's so challenging in so many ways. So I think there's not enough attention devoted to either how to age better or what the old people have to offer. Wharton writes, in spite of illness, in spite even of the arch enemy sorrow, one can remain alive long past the usual date of disintegration. I wonder what that would be. If one is unafraid of change, insatiable in intellectual curiosity, interested in big things, and happy in small ways. In the course of sorting and setting down of my memories, I've learned that these advantages are usually independent of one's merits, and that I probably owe my happy old age to the ancestor who accidentally endowed me with these qualities. You know, she's sort of saying, I have good brain chemistry. Maybe I have good DNA. I mean, I think that one of the things that's frightening is we can't really control how we will age. We can control it much more medically than we used to be able to, but people used to say about my husband, oh, he was so bright, he was so brilliant.
Yeah.
How could he get demented? So I think there is a lot of wisdom in old age. You see that in a piece I wrote before Biden stepped down in the summer, just sort of like Oedipus and Oedipus at Colonus, who's a very old man about to die, explains to Theseus that if you're mortal, you can't help getting old. Sort of what Sappho says in the poem I read at the beginning. I feel like we've kind of lost sight of that.
I love that line. You can't be an ageless human being.
Being an ageless
Can't
human
get
is
it,
not
good.
possible. I
Right.
wish she'd said human being, but yeah, that's right.
Being an
That's a
ageless-
wonderful
Oh,
line.
yeah, absolutely.
It is.
But, you know, it also implies, in a way, that we are all trying to be that ageless human. And, you know, what is the negotiation in ourselves between giving over to accepting that we're not an ageless, that we can't be that ageless human being, and still, you know, Kunitz's desire, 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 or Stryker's thirst, right? You know, these things are very real still.
Well, the gods ate nectar and ambrosia, and the word ambrosia goes back to the Greek word for mortal. It means something like immortality food. That's what they consumed.
Yay.
Immortality.
Can we get some?
Yeah. I was just thinking,
People are
what?
selling it on the internet.
Bee pollen,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Bee pollen.
It's a dietary supplement, basically. Yeah.
So any supplements that you can recommend, Caitlin?
There are always ones of the day.
Do crossword puzzles.
Are there any more
Oh,
questions?
God, I hate crossword puzzles.
Thank you all.
So I'll see you later.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. I don't know if I have your address. I'm looking forward to it too. I'm also at Arthur Carter. Oh, okay. Oh, great. The neighbors.
72 East 91st.
Okay, and I can ask Anne Marie as well in case you.
Yeah, you can ask him.
Okay.
You can also ask. You don't have my email.
I don't think I have yours, but I'll just email Anne Marie and I'll get it. And I look forward to seeing you later. See you tonight. Yes, that will be a pleasure.
You have Alex.
Oh yeah, right. I do. Okay, so it'll be all be fine. Well, thank you for steering the vehicle.